Okay. See if the mic is working. Testing one, two. Okay, seems to work. Welcome to Dis and Dat for September. Thought I'd do something slightly different just to break up the fact that we're looking at free stuff and only minor digression on inequality in the capital controversy. The Cambridge view of technical progress in technological progress in Piketty and Marxological progress in Piketty and Marx. He's done TED Talks, and I've included a thing about a nice big graphic on 42% of Americans own, that is 1% own 42% of American wealth, 4% own 30%, 5% own 13%, and 10% own 11%. So clearly, at 80% of Americans own 5% of American wealth. And of course, that's an issue for some of us working in a somewhat more political vein. And so I think you can see why wealth grows faster than the economy. And the deal that Piketty talks about is the difference between the growth rate and the rate of return on capital. These aren't very Marxian ideas. It's just simply how capital operates. And of course, there's concentration, and the relation of R&G was probably less pronounced during the mid 20th century, but by comparison, this is the great acceleration, the period of unprecedented economic growth, and it went on for 30 some odd years. Not that it's like a mortgage or anything, but it is over. And so things are still disproportionate, and it's going to continue. And it's a question of thinking about it in these very large terms. But on the one hand, on the other hand, if we aren't aware of them, then people are just going to continue. Certain classes of people are going to be continue to be greedy. And frankly, one Lamborghini is enough, at least for some of us. So we're we're going to approach the 19th century in some ways, which is kind of Piketty's point. It's going to look, the 21st century is going to look more like the 19th century for a variety of reasons. But anyway, so I've included a little bit on that and a précis, as it were, of capital of the 21st century, and two videos related to TED Talks, and then I'm just going to read a little bit from this particular article. And I recommend it to you, Sarah Nicolkut, just because it's a working paper and it asks certain questions that are a reasonable introduction to try and reconcile Piketty's capital in the 21st century and clearly the older Marxist debate on the falling rate of profit in comparison to the development of the modern growth and distribution literature in the Cambridge tradition. Marx biased technological progress and Piketty's formula are two different theories explaining the same phenomenon of instability and inequality in the distribution of income. In contrast, the Cambridge Keynesians focus on the balanced growth path, which leaves the profit rate as the only degree of freedom formalized in the so-called Cambridge equation. Now, these two Cambridges, England and Massachusetts, there's no theoretical conclusion of an inequality trend in the Cambridge framework in comparison to Piketty's Capital in the 21st century and Marx's falling rate of profit. Um, they're just different. This paper evaluates and provides a history of economic thought / economic analysis for technological progress in the context of capital theory from each perspective. In this climate of instability, the controversies in the theory of capital becomes even more relevant to our discussion of political economy. Introduction. If Joan Robinson and I are wrong in this contention, we're dead wrong. Paul Samuelson in 1960. The immediate and growing threat to capitalism in recent times is the problem of rising inequality from economic progress. Many economists refer to this trend of inequality outlined in the famous empirical study by Thomas Piketty. However, inequality and instability in modern economies is not a new idea. A contemporary Marxist theorist debated about the nature of inequality and the falling rate of profit before the publication of Piketty's Capital in the 21st century. Their studies have been driven by the observed disparity of neoliberalism. Developed economies around the world have seen an increase in the profit share at the expense of the wage share. That we've talked about this before, and we were just talking about it in relationship to Alyssa's book. Although inequality is not a prevalence conclusion of modern capitalism, this trend of instability and the distribution of income started after the so-called golden age of capitalism of the post-war period, that is post-World War II, which saw win-win economic progress in both capital and labor. Post-World War II economists observed a uniform rise in both profits and wages. Neutral technological progress is the foundation of the growth and distribution literature that we use today and that was developed by the Cambridge Keynesians. Thus, we have a sharp distinction in the perceived effect of economic progress between the inequality of neoliberalism and the win-win post-World War II facts. This distinction leads us to the question of what the long-period position of capitalism is, and does economic progress have a disruptive nature that creates unemployment and economic inequality? And that disruptive nature, of course, is what we were talking about before with Anwar Sheikh's work when he was talking about turbulence. The disparity in empirical evidence between the neoliberal era and the Golden Age led Piketty, the modern Marxist theorist, and the Cambridge Keynesians to theorize differently about the long-period tendency of economic progress in capitalism. Their attempts to fit empirical findings into mathematical models have proven to be very complex because of the unclear relationship among capital, labor, and the profit rate. Both Piketty and the modern Marxist theorists run into the same problem of measuring capital, as did the view regarding Marx's falling rate of profit. C. Samuelson, 1957, and let's see. Their explanations of the dynamic change in macroeconomic variables require their own separate theory of technological progress. This paper purports to compare the three viewpoints on technology in the hope of deepening our understanding of the nature of economic progress and the concept of capital. In Piketty's Capital in the 21st century, rising inequality is due to the discrepancy between wealth or capital accumulation and its rate of return or the profit rate. Piketty theorizes about the cause of rising inequality through his observation of the 2 degrees of freedom. That the rate of profit has a historical tendency to be more than the rate of growth, and that the ratio of capital to income increases. The two degrees of freedom are interrelated, but we will focus first on the capital to income ratio. The ratio of capital income, or the capital output ratio in the terminology of the growth and distribution literature, measures the amount of capital that is required to create a unit of output. Now, an increase in the capital to income ratio means that the economic production needs more capital to produce one unit of output, which is where technological progress comes into play. The rising capital income ratio can be interpreted as the natural pattern of technological progress and also an overaccumulation of wealth inequality, which I think you can historically see that. The pattern of technological progress that fits the observed inequality is biased. Piketty states that the long period elasticity of substitution between capital and labor is greater than 1. That's pretty obvious. We will examine the measure of elasticity of substitution between capital and labor in the next section. Bias in technological progress is also a subject of inquiry for the contemporary Marxist theorists. However, more than just an attempt to explain the adverse empirical trend of inequality, Marx-biased technological progress stems from the theoretical need to retain Marx's assertion of the falling rate of profit that has been disproved by the Occhio theorem. This is actually an important, sidelight on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a whole bunch of issues that are related to it, but it is a very big piece of the broad Marxist literature. Technological progress is used to show that the falling rate of profit is still a possibility under the assumptions of firm behavior and real competition. The modern Marxist theorists assume that technological progress is costly and ultimately determines the amount of capital and labor used in the firm production techniques. The technique of production is chosen according to the innovation possibility frontier of each period. Now, technological progress is biased because of an exogenously given and outwardly given elliptical technological frontier that increases the capital output ratio. The profit rate will fall if the profit rate increases by a lesser proportion of the capital output ratio. The modern Marxist theorist falling rate of profit scheme relies on an assumption that we know the value of capital from the result of biased technological progress. In contrast to both Piketty and Marx, the Cambridge Keynesians leave the rate of profit as the only degree of freedom. Passanetti, in 1974, summarized this condition in the Cambridge equation, quote unquote, which explains a whole exogenously determined profit rate in an expanding economy. Now, although the Cambridge Keynesians are famous for their debate in the Cambridge capital theory controversy, they share the same hypothesis of the long period full employment capitalism. The Keynesian problem of Harrod-Domar adjustment forces the capital output ratio to be within a range of neutrality. The Cambridge Keynesians analysis of the effect of economic progress is known as exhibiting, quote unquote, balanced growth. They have inherited the spirit of Keynesianism and the adjustment from short period variations of depression and inequality. However, the Cambridge equation has been the subject of scrutiny and has never been considered to the full extent of its implications. The author argues that the assumptions surrounding the Cambridge equation are justified because of the principle of Keynesian adjustment to long period full employment capitalism and the metaphysical position regarding the concept of capital. So both of those are, problematic for all kinds of reasons that we've discussed before on the question of full employment. In this paper, I draw upon prominent Cambridge Keynesian criticism, Rowthorne, Harcourt, of prominent Cambridge Keynesian criticisms of Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century in comparison to the modern Marxist theory's biased technical progress theory, Shake, Dumenil, Levy, Foley, Mikhill, Park, etc. I further direct the reader's attention to the long period full employment problems of Harrod-Domar and Passanetti's solution of the Cambridge equation, 74. A discussion of growth, distribution, and technological progress theories from competing perspectives is relevant to this current debate about the problem of inequality. Capital accumulation, technological progress, and the distribution of income are the three issues of concern here, in addition to the spirit of Keynesian adjustment. The interrelation between economic progress to capital and labor is central to Piketty, the Marxist theorist, and the Cambridge Keynesians. The next section examines Piketty's formula and his explanations of inequality. The third section describes the modern Marxist theorist's view of bias in technological improvement. The fourth section discusses the Cambridge view of economic progress and its relation to the concept of capital. Capital is a metaphysical concept of political economy that entails political philosophy of natural liberty and economic progress. Capital is the title and the focus of the analysis in Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty is aware of the problem of distribution of income between wages and profits. He begins part one of the book describing the conflict between capital and labor, acknowledging that whereas workers demand wages, returns have to be paid to attract more capital. So, however, Piketty treats capital only in physical forms. He defines capital, because it's really a lot harder. He defines capital as physical assets and even emphasizes that his measure of capital excludes the neoclassical concept of human capital. Capital is treated from empirical data as given, that i.e. ex post. Piketty is clear that his preferred methodology is based on the French tradition that focuses on empirical facts rather than theory to appeal to academics and other disciplines. The terms capital and wealth are interchangeable in Piketty's measurement. In effect, Piketty has blended the distinction of individual wealth with the macroeconomic sphere of political economy between capital and labor. And it's the practical empirical method that defines Piketty's model. He establishes an observation that the profit share alpha is a multiple of the profit rate R, and that the capital to income ratio beta is alpha R times B, beta. The relation between the three variables is dynamic. Conceptually, they're 2 degrees of freedom, as Piketty describes it. Piketty analyzes his data based on this formula. For example, in Piketty's illustration, if the capital to income ratio is 6 and the profit rate is 5%, the profit share will be 30%. The other 70% is for labor. This law of income accounting allows Piketty to track the movements and the distribution of income through the 2 degrees of freedom of the capital to income ratio and the rate of profit. Now, Piketty devotes a part of his book to the first degree of freedom, the capital to income ratio beta. This ratio is a fundamental law, which he states as beta equals S times G, SG, where S is the saving rate and G is the growth rate. Piketty provides a lengthy discussion of the variation of the capital to income ratio and how it changes over time, from the privatization of wealth to issues of asset price valuation. He estimates that the long-run tendency of the capital to income ratio will increase to about 7 by the end of this century, which is high, and which will have a significant impact on the distribution of income between capital and labor. The second degree of freedom is the rate of return on capital, or the profit rate. Piketty discusses his empirical evidence of the peer return to capital and its relation to the capital-labor split. In my opinion, that the author, his discussions of the return to capital rely too much on empirical data. Well, that's sort of the point for Piketty. And he does not provide an adequate assessment of the various theories of the profit rate. Well, should you? And that's another interesting question. In effect, Piketty's discussion of the long-run fundamental laws is incomplete and arguably compatible to his empirical evidence. Furthermore, The most famous finding in the book concerns the inequality in the individualistic sphere. That is, wealth or capital is concentrated among individuals in the top percentile, and the gap is getting wider, as I showed in the graph above. Piketty's central thesis explaining this inequality is based on the natural tendency, that's problematic for its own reasons, for the rate of profit to be more than the rate of growth. R is greater than G. The structure of inequality is created by the accumulation of wealth and economic growth. Wealth accumulates at a higher rate and concentrates on a small group of people because the rate of profit is more than the rate of growth. Now, since Piketty uses wealth and capital sort of interchangeably, the problem is that if this wealth is used in economic production, it should force technological progress to shift to a higher capital to income ratio. There is a fallacy here. On the one hand, Piketty asserts that wealth or capital is accumulated in an unbalanced proportion. On the other hand, he maintains that there is a long run level of the capital to income ratio. A coherent story has to be that an unbalanced accumulation of wealth from R greater than G will change the technological structure of production towards using more capital. The innate structure of wealth inequality will also create a bias in technological progress in which more capital is needed to create a unit of output. The capital to income ratio is forced to change from the unbalanced accumulation. The inequality in wealth between the upper percentile and the lower percentile is by no means separate from the relations that we have between capitalists and workers. The demographic issue of wealth distribution is entangled with the problem of income distribution that Piketty has discussed in the long-run split of capital and labor. The interrelation of Piketty's inequality and wealth accumulation and his long-run tendency laws is a point of confusion because of the dynamic nature of capitalism. J.R. Hicks analyzed this difficulty before and combined the two conditions in one term as a form of elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. The elasticity of substitution measures the effect of an increase of factors of production on the distribution of income. If the elasticity of substitution is equal to 1, i.e. the Cobb-Douglas production function, and an increase in one factor input will benefit both capital and labor and preserve the split distributive share. However, the Cobb-Douglas production is an exceptional case, and the elasticity of substitution of other CES production functions estimated in the literature is not equal to 1. Piketty also acknowledges that the long-run elasticity of substitution of capital for labor is probably greater than 1, which implies a bias in technological progress. Piketty assumes that technology is an exogenous shock that has neither limits nor morality, as quoted above. However, he does not make an adequate assessment of biased technological progress with respect to the bigger issue of the progress with respect an adequate assessment of biased technological progress with respect to his bigger issue of the structure of inequality and wealth accumulation and his long-run fundamental laws. So if there is any reconcilable theme among Piketty, the Marxist theorists, and the Cambridge Keynesians, it is that they recognize this inevitable crash or adjustment of the economic system. Piketty devotes a section in his book to tax as a mechanism to regulate inequality. Now, the remedy to this spiral accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few will be on a tax on capital and the income tax. However, Piketty's tax solution still runs into the fallacy between the individualistic sphere and the political economy sphere. Her understanding, the author's understanding of the neoclassical explanations of induced technological progress is limited, and so she refers to Brugger and Gerke's critical survey of the neoclassical approach to induced technical progress and the elasticity of substitution. Now, although we have a flat tax rate on capital, the effective tax rate is in favor of individuals in the upper class who pay a less effective tax than people in the middle class. Individuals receive income from labor, wage, and capital gain. The effective tax rate is calculated from both. The tax loopholes are used across individual income and capital income. Inequality of wealth accumulation comes from both wages and profits. We do not have a clear separation between individual labor and wealth capital owned by individuals, just like the paradox in the capital theory. Now, the measure of capital is a point of contention here. His 2 degrees of freedom of the rate of profit and the capital to income ratio are interrelated. In comparison, the modern tool we use in the same manner as Piketty's 2 degrees of freedom is the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. The measure of elasticity of substitution itself is the subject of scrutiny. Capital is the center of the dynamic question of economic progress and the distribution of income. Piketty's attempt to theorize his empirical findings is characterized by the same fallacy as found in the capital theory, which makes his long-run theory inconsistent. Now, through his accounting of labor value, Marx theorizes that the rate of profit will continue to fall due to increases in constant capital from accumulation if the rate of surplus value does not change. Now, this theory has fallen out of favor among contemporary Marxist theorists due to the incompatibility of the empirical pattern of the rate of profit and a damning critique of the criteria of adoption against Marx's falling rate of profit, known as the Okishio theorem. However, the neoliberal era saw a renewed interest in Marx's falling rate of profit theory due to a change in the observed trend of the profit rate, Dumino, Click, and Wrangle. Hence, the motive of the Marxist theorists we discuss here concerns both the empirical trend and the theoretical problem of the nature of the profit rate. Their economic methodology is a mix of the empirical and theoretical, in sharp contrast to Piketty. Well, that's the way it's, in one sense, that's the way it is, in fact. And Piketty's empiricism is not as absolute as one might think. But anyway, Marx biased technological progress theory aims to answer both the theoretical problem and the empirical issue about the nature of the rate of profit. In the contemporary Marxist view, the pattern of technological progress that we see today has a biased nature, which creates conflict in the distribution of income and that falling rate of profit. However, the Okishio theorem theoretically disproves Marx's assertion quoted above that there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Given that the wage rate is constant, the technological progress that the capitalists choose will not lower the rate of profit. The Okishio theorem is based on firms' behavior in adopting cost reduction, the cost reductions of technical innovation, and that's been covered by a bunch of folks, Shake, Romer, and Bowles. Improvement that reduces the cost of production will increase firms' profitability, or at least not lower it. Now, that there's a whole argument there, but we'll get back to that. First, the theorem makes practical sense in a micro-foundations perspective that firms will adopt technical improvement for profitability. Second, it's also mathematically proven through the Frobenius-Perrin condition of the unique positive solution. The Okishio theorem contradicts Marx's assumption regarding the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, which many Marxists consider central to Marx's analysis of the inherent instability of capitalism. This is problematic for all kinds of reasons and worth another discussion somewhere else. There have been various reactions and solutions to the Okishio theorem. The one we're here concerned is the model of evolutionary technical progress, that is Dumenil and Levy, Foley, Nikiel. The model emphasizes capital accumulation and the effect of progress on the distribution of income. It provides a consistent story of inequality in the rise of the capital output ratio and the profit share, as well as the falling rate of profit. Now, in contrast to Piketty's 2 degrees of freedom, the modern Marx theorists rely only on bias in technological progress. It is the pattern of viable technological progress that causes the falling rate of profit and rising inequality in the distribution of income. Now, the pattern of viable technological progress is obviously, this is problematic for all kinds of sort of modern or modernizing relations and certainly needs a bigger discussion. The theory of Marx biased technical progress explains the pattern of technology through the profit-seeking nature of capitalistic competition. The pattern of technological progress is chosen through viable profit-maximizing behavior. Bias and improvement from innovation that decreases or increases the efficiency of capital and labor affects profitability in the next period, and capitalists will choose bias and improvement that, in the short run, initially benefits profitability and capitalistic production. However, once the improvement is in effect, it is possible that the profit rate will decrease. This pattern of the falling rate of profit requires that the chosen pattern of improvement must lower the efficiency of capital, i.e., lower the capital output ratio. The improvement has to be perversely biased. Now, this is a whole nother thing that has other probably empirical issues. But anyway, let's get back to this. The modern Marxist theorists explain this perverse pattern by assuming that the innovation possibility frontier has an elliptical exogenous shape. See figure 1 below, but not included, unfortunately, here. But technological progress in that view is exogenously given. Although it is in the nature of capitalistic competition that determines the pattern of technological progress, the modern Marxist theorists still need an assumption that the innovation possibility frontier is elliptical toward decreasing efficiency of capital. Capitalists choose biased technological progress at point X in the top left quadrant of figure 1 because the mean average of the innovation possibility frontier above the viable competitive profit rate of the red line. I'm sorry I didn't include that. The mean average of the area in the elliptical frontier is at point X. Hence, biased technological progress is not precisely chosen from capitalistic behavior, but is influenced by the available exogenous elliptical innovation possibility frontier. The effect of technological progress is assumed to be biased in the first place. Besides, it's not clear if we should classify Marx-biased technological progress as capital using, labor augmenting, labor saving, or all of the above. I will further explain Marx-biased technical progress theory in section 5. The fear of disruptive technological progress has been discussed extensively by economists in every period. Technology is assumed to be an uncontrollable force that affects the relation between capital and labor. The bias classification of the effect of technological progress is, in fact, an inconsistent measure. Now, we should avoid using the words augmented, saving, using, etc., to describe the characteristics of technological improvement because it is not clear how to determine the exact effect of technological progress on capital, labor, and economic growth. On the one hand, technological progress requires an accumulation of capital. On the other hand, technological progress can decrease or increase the productiveness of capital and labor. And since we cannot determine the measure of capital using, labor augmenting, and labor saving improvement can be interpreted to come from the same technological shock. Well, you can, I hope, see the issue there. The classification of improvement characterized as augmented, saving, and using seems to be redundant, which is the logic of the Cambridge Capital controversy concerning the effect of technological progress. The modern Marx theorists, however, fall into this fallacy of determining the effect of technological progress. Their assertion of Marx-biased technological progress is similar to Ricardo's claim about machinery, Schumpeter's creative destruction, and many other economists' view of technological progress as a quote-unquote, as an uncontrollable shock. The interrelation of technological progress, the distribution of income, and capital accumulation has been a puzzle to economists, and many of them blame economic progress for inequality and instability. Technological progress theories hence mostly concern how the dynamic interaction of capital accumulation and technology affects the distribution of income. The Cambridge Keynesians, during the post-war period of the modern development of our growth and distribution literature, had debated about this nature of technological progress. However, It was the issue of Herod-Domar Keynesian adjustment and the neutral characteristics of technology that also dominated their view. Moreover, they've had an agenda to connect the problem of dynamic capitalism to classical political economy. In the process, the modern debate about capital, labor, and economic progress has become, well, metaphysical, whatever that means. The argument of the Cambridge Keynesians became metaphysical because they inherited the debate about the theories of value from classical economics in the form of the capital controversy. Both Cambridge, England, and Cambridge, Massachusetts Keynesians rely on the labor theory of value and the marginal theory of value as a theoretical foundation for the theory of income distribution. Joan Robinson in 1962 acknowledged that their scientific method is very close to metaphysics. However, more than just economic metaphysics, the Cambridge Keynesians were fixated on their experience of win-win capitalism in the post-war era. As mentioned by Solow, Joan Robinson accepted the empirical fact of a constant capital output ratio of the post-war period. A constant capital output ratio means that technological progress is neutral and that economic progress provides a win-win benefit to both capital and labor. They have in the back of their minds the issue of theoretical consistency that needs to be fitted to their observed empirical facts. And, we haven't even talked about, the thing that we were just talking about yesterday about externalities. But anyway, moreover, the two Cambridges are the successor of the Keynesian change of paradigm. They also need to consider the Keynesian question of, it made my day. I knew it could do better than that, and I knew she'd been forced by practicality, even imaginary practicality, to give up the metaphysical ghost. I smiled all the way home to tell my wife that Joan had buckled and violated her own metaphysics. Anyway. Although this paper considers Cambridge Keynesians from both England and Massachusetts, long period adjustment to full employment capitalism, I argue, based on these three bases of the theories of value, the post-war stylized facts, and the Keynesian principle of adjustment to full employment, about the validity of the Cambridge equation proposed by Passanetti in relation to the effect of technological progress on the distribution of income. The Cambridge Keynesians based their central analysis on the Harrod-Domar problem of adjustment in capitalism, which propounded that there is no guarantee for the rate of growth, G, to be equal to the natural rate of growth, Gn, that ensures the stability of capitalism. The solutions from both sides of Cambridge implicitly assume adjustment to the long period full employment position. Nicholas Kaldor emphasized the condition of full employment. Joan Robinson wrote intensively about golden age capitalism in her two books on growth and distribution. The position was also adopted in the Solow Swan model. This position of long period full employment capitalism controversial assumption has been subjected to a great deal of internal criticism. The approach does not provide enough narrative of how the full employment position is reached, if ever, and does not have the micro foundations of a real economy. Samuelson even dubbed it the mechanism of Jean-Baptiste Kaldor in reference to J.B. Say, making fun of Kaldor's lack of explanation for the full employment assumption in a parody of the famous Jean-Baptiste Say supplied side law. Now, the criticism of long period full employment position are valid and have spawned a long list of published comments. However, I want to argue that the standpoint of the long period where is the principle of effective demand? The long period position and the principle of effective demand seem to be disconnected. And a bunch of folks, Joan Robinson included, had tried to extend the Keynesian principle to the long period before, and her attempt failed to materialize. The theoretical development, however, culminated with the Harrod-Domar problem. Pasinetti gave his assessment in his chapter 4, From Classical to Keynesian Economic Dynamics. See also Pasinetti 14. Employment of the Cambridge Keynesians is justified. Their concern is about the effect on the distribution of income in relation to the dynamic of capital accumulation in the long period. They have to assume that the economic system adjusts to stability through Keynesian principles. The explanation and microfoundations of adjustment are thus omitted in the process. The more critical question is a metaphysical one regarding the concept of capital. In the long period capitalism that adjusts through the Keynesian principle emerges a theory of the rate of profit in an expanding economy unique to the Cambridge Keynesian approach. I restate Pasinetti's interpretation of Harrod-Domar's dilemma and his result for the Cambridge equation here. In the long period full employment, the natural rate of growth is equal to the warranted rate of growth. That is, Gn equals G equals SKY. The Harrod-Domar relation becomes S equals Gn KY number one, where S is the saving to income ratio, KY is the capital output ratio, and Gn is the exogenous natural rate of growth. There is no guarantee that the economy will accumulate according to the natural rate of growth for full employment, which will cause instability. The Kaldor-Pasinetti solution to the Harrod-Domar problem is an adjustment of the distribution of income, and they assume that in a long period, investment is equal to savings, i.e. stability I equals S. Capital accumulation comes first from the two classes of workers and capitalists, Gn, Ky equals SW, WY plus SCPY. 2, where SW is the savings rate of workers, SW, workers, right? W is workers, out of the wage share, WY, and SC is the saving rate of capitalists out of the profit share, PY. Equation 2 shows the Keynesian theory of distribution and its adjustment rule. Pasinetti gave a full solution provided that the workers' savings rate is less than the capitalist savings rate, SWG. The profit rate is associated with capital and the growth rate with output, which can be translated to mean that the capital grows faster than output. Big K, capital K, big K is greater than big Y. The capital output ratio will increase from an unbalanced wealth accumulation. Second, Piketty also states that the pattern of technology is biased towards elasticity of substitution that is more than one, which, according to the Hicksian definition, means the profit share will increase. However, neoclassical economics does not have a separate theory of the profit rate, and it's not clear if the elasticity of substitution affects the profit rate or the capital output ratio, or both. The profit rate might increase, causing a rise in the profit share, or there might be a bias in the technological progress that increases the capital output ratio. Hence, both of Piketty's 2 degrees of freedom describe similar scenarios, which is shown by the up and down arrows. The wage rate is going down, the profit rate and the capital output ratio are going up. There's an entangled relation between capital accumulation and technological progress. One equals downward arrow, small w, L, Y, plus upward arrow, R, upward arrow, KY. Equation 5. Piketty's long-run fundamental degrees of freedom are redundant within themselves because in neoclassical economics, the profit rate is not separated from capital. There's no steady state in this formulation. The capital output ratio and the profit share will always be increasing, and capitalism is unstable. Similarly, Marx shows the crisis of capitalism through his relation between the accumulating organic composition of capital and the extracting of the surplus value. Marx makes an observation that whereas capital accumulates more and more, the surplus value that capitalists extract from workers seems to have stagnated. Hence, the rate of profit will decrease. In modern technological progress terms, Marxist theorists interpret the scenario oops, sorry. Sorry, I lost my place. Neoclassical economists have speculated about diminishing returns on capital. See Samuelson's solution of neutral technological progress in 1965. Again, as in Piketty, although the rate of profit is left exogenous, we still have an entanglement between the elasticity of substitution and the classification of technological progress. So there's a negative bias in capital improvement. Capitalists choose bias in technological progress that meets their viable competitive profit rate from an exogenous elliptical innovation possibility frontier, which is shown in the graph I didn't show. Marx bias technological progress explains the empirical evidences of neoliberalism for a decrease in the wage share, which is very important, a rise in capital output ratio, and a falling rate of profit, where 1 equals downward arrow, WLY plus downward arrow R, upward arrow KY, equation 6. The main difference between Marx bias technological progress and Piketty is the determination of the profit rate. Now, the profit rate is not a degree of freedom and is endogenously determined in the dynamic of capitalism. Although the profit share has increased, if bias in technological progress increases the capital output ratio even more, the profit rate will fall, which shows the instability of capitalism that leads to Marx's gloomy conclusions. And it doesn't happen as easy as that, and a lot of people have spent a lot of ink trying to prove it. In contrast, the Cambridge Keynesians have a different view of win-win capitalism. The position of long-period, full employment capitalism is unique to the Keynesian paradigm. The rate of profit is determined through the adjustment to full employment according to the natural rate of growth. Now, equation 7, I think, is even more complicated. The point is that there is a relationship between value of capital and the two rates. And let me skip below without making you too crazy. Capitalism in the Cambridge Keynesian view is stable. Economic progress benefits and ceases and eases the conflict between capitalists and workers. Economic progress benefits and eases the conflict between capitalists and workers. Since the real wage, employment, and the rate of profit are determined according to the full employment assumption, problematic, the only endogenous variable is the value of capital. The pattern of technological progress, the capital output ratio, is controlled within the Harrod-Domar condition and the Keynesian principle of adjustment to full employment. That's a lot of assumptions. With technological progress, it should be noted here that the trade-off of an inverse relation between the real wage and the profit rate is not a necessary condition as normally assumed in the growth and distribution literature. First, the rate of profit has been separated according to the exogenous natural rate of growth. Second, technological progress provides a dynamic perspective for a surplus economy in comparison to a static economy with no surplus. Problematic already. The distribution of income is still a conflict of political economy between capitalists and workers on how they reach and adjust to the Keynesian position of long period full employment. However, in the Cambridge tradition, economic progress and technology enable a win-win situation that eases the conflict between capital and labor. Conclusion, after a lot of arm waving, the quote, the rich only select from the heap what is most precious and agreeable. They consume little more than the poor. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life, advance the interests of society, and afford means to the multiplication of the species. So, yeah, Adam Smith. So, leading the, close quote. Technological progress in the Cambridge Keynesian tradition is thus controlled to preserve the Keynesian full employment position. Capital is a metaphysical concept and an adjustment variable. The capital output ratio becomes an endogenous variable. The most consistent story, given the steady state of capitalism, is that the Cambridge Keynesian one is the Cambridge Keynesian one. In the long period, Keynesian full employment capitalism, the rate of profit from the Cambridge equation determines the value of capital. In comparison, this paper shows that Piketty's long run fundamental laws are inconsistent. The 2 degrees of freedom of the capital output ratio and the profit rate in neoclassical economics are interrelated. Piketty's story of wealth inequality cannot persist in the long period steady state, and technology cannot be blamed for creating the capital and labor split of the distributor's share. Similarly, modern Marxist theorists consider bias in technological progress to be the source of the capitalist crisis and the falling rate of profit. The assumption relies heavily on an exogenous, elliptical, technological possibility frontier, and Sraffa may be the best place to look for that, but recall that Sraffa puts a lot of limitations on the model. Economic progress is assumed to create instability in the first place. In my opinion, both Piketty and the Marxist theorists have a crucial weakness regarding the concept of capital. The lesson we've learned from the controversies of the theory of capital since the time of the classical political economists is that the concept of capital and capital accumulation, although it represents the progression of human cooperation and knowledge, has a measurement problem. There is no clear relation between the rate of profit and the value of capital. There is a problem of knowledge to identify the value of capital. It is impossible to justify the returns to technological productive capacity and assign its value without considering the other factor of production of labor and the wage. Note that the wage was important for our little reading of Alyssa's work. Especially in the dynamics of economic growth, the assumption that concerns bias in technological progress between capital and labor is entangled with the problem of measurement. The classification of technological progress labeled as bias towards either capital or labor is thus redundant in the long period. What the Keynesian paradigm adds to the capital theory is the principle of adjustment to full employment. Now, we see this full employment position in the Harrod-Domar problem that both Cambridge, England, and Cambridge, Massachusetts Keynesians have engaged during the decades-long debate. Keynes wrote at the time of the Great Wars and economic crises about the possibility of adjustment to full employment. The Cambridge Keynesians have inherited this full employment principle and extended to the long period analysis of classical political economy. They have engaged in a debate that can be traced back to the foundation of political economy and the labor theory of value and the marginal theory of value. However, the Cambridge Keynesians have one mutual unique position of win-win capitalism. The Keynesian paradigm of full employment has added to the debate about the theory of value the separation of the exogenous rate of profit from the concept of capital. The value of capital becomes an adjustment variable, in contrast to Piketty's view that historical events create shocks that disturb the long-run fundamental laws. Wars, economic recessions, political crises, civil disobedience, etc., are spontaneous orders that adjust the economic system to the long period position. Throughout history, we have seen catastrophic adjustments when liberal democratic process and human cooperation fail to make changes and adjust. The value of capital changes abruptly to restore the full employment position. Similar to Adam Smith's invisible hand quoted above, the adjustment to the full employment win-win capitalism is a metaphysical position in the science of man and the problem of knowledge. Capital theory entails both political and moral philosophy and economics. In this climate of instability, the controversies in the theory of capital becomes even more relevant to our discussion of political economy. So, whether she got to any real point is problematic because, as if you've been listening to Steve Keen talk about full employment, this may just be a lot of hand waving and amusing from a mathematical point of view, but it, with all due respect to her position and Piketty's, it's empirical work is still really important in this particular context. So that's sort of where I wound up with this particular article, and we'll return to free gifts tomorrow, and we have several more chapters of free gifts, so we're probably going to go into next week on that with the usual shift in weekly marks on the weekend. Let me thank you very much for your attention.